The Miller farm had been in the family for generations. The sprawling fields, the weathered barns, and the old farmhouse stood as a testament to years of hard work and toil. But now, it was a shadow of its former self. The fields lay barren, and the barns were crumbling. The only constant was the massive rusted tractor, sitting unused in the middle of the farm. It hadn't been moved in years, its hulking frame a reminder of better times. John Miller had taken over the farm from his father, and though times were tough, he did his best to keep the place running. His son, Tommy, was fascinated by the tractor. At 8 years old, Tommy's curiosity often led him to places he wasn't supposed to go. His father had warned him many times to stay away from the old machine. It was dangerous, its parts rusted and its gears broken. But like most young boys, the allure of something forbidden was too tempting. One hot summer afternoon, John was working in the barn, trying to fix a broken fence, while Tommy played nearby. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the farm. The air was thick with the smell of dust and hay. John wiped the sweat from his brow, unaware that Tommy had wandered off. Tommy's footsteps were light as he approached the rusted tractor. Its once vibrant green paint had long since faded, replaced by patches of rust and grime. The seat was covered in dirt, and the large wheels were half buried in the ground. But to Tommy, it was still a marvel. He climbed up onto the seat, pretending to drive, his small hands gripping the cold metal steering wheel. As he played, Tommy noticed something glinting beneath the tractor. Curious, he jumped down and crawled underneath to get a better look. It was a wrench, probably left there by his grandfather years ago. As he reached for it, the tractor creaked, its rusted metal groaning under its own weight. Suddenly, the tractor shifted. The heavy machinery, unused for years, began to move. The front end dipped down, and before Tommy could react, he was pinned beneath the enormous weight. The sharp edge of the metal dug into his small frame, and he screamed out in pain. John heard the scream, his heart stopping in his chest. He dropped his tools and ran toward the sound, his mind racing with fear. As he rounded the corner, he saw it. The tractor had shifted, and Tommy was trapped underneath. John's legs gave out, but he forced himself to move. He reached the tractor and tried to lift it, his hands slipping on the rusted metal. Tommy's eyes were wide with terror, his small voice weak as he called for his father. John pulled with all his might, but the machine wouldn't budge. Frantic, John ran back to the barn to grab a crowbar. But when he returned, Tommy had stopped crying. His small body was still, his eyes closed. John fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. The sun had set, and the farm was cloaked in darkness. The only sound was the soft rustle of the wind through the fields, as if the land itself was mourning. The next day, the neighbors found John sitting next to the tractor, staring blankly ahead. Tommy's body had already been taken away, but John couldn't bring himself to leave. The guilt consumed him. He should have watched his son more closely, should have warned him more sternly. But now, it was too late. The Miller farm was never the same after that. John stopped working the land, and the fields grew wild. The tractor, still rusted and unmoved, sat in the same spot, its presence a constant reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. Years passed, and the story of Tommy's death became legend. The new owners of the farm often spoke of strange occurrences near the tractor, shadows moving where there shouldn't be, the sound of a child's laughter carried on the wind, and on quiet nights, the faint creaking of rusted metal. Some said that Tommy's spirit never left the farm, forever trapped by the machine that had taken his life. Others believed it was just a sad reminder of the dangers that lurked in forgotten places. But one thing was certain. The rusted tractor would forever be a symbol of loss, and the land around it would never truly be at peace. The farm had been abandoned for years, left to decay under the relentless sun and time. No one dared to set foot near it, not since the incident. Sarah had heard the rumors her whole life, whispers about what had happened on the farm's last night of operation. The massive silo, standing tall and rusted in the middle of the property, was said to be cursed. No crops had grown on the land since, and the townspeople avoided it as though it carried a plague. Sarah didn't believe in curses, though. She was a practical person, and the idea of a haunted silo seemed ridiculous. So when her uncle, who had recently bought the land at auction, asked her to help with some basic maintenance before he could sell it, she didn't hesitate. It was just an old farm, nothing more. The air was thick with the smell of dry earth as she pulled up to the farm in her truck. The fields were barren, the once productive land now cracked and dry. In the distance, the towering silo stood like a monument to the past, casting long shadows across the empty landscape. The farmhouse was barely standing, its roof caved in, and the barns looked ready to collapse at any moment. But the silo, it was eerily untouched by the decay around it. Sarah parked her truck and began unloading her tools. The plan was simple: inspect the silo, make sure it wasn't about to collapse, and check if there were any signs of squatters. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the land, but she wanted to get started before it got dark. As she walked toward the silo, a strange feeling settled over her. The wind had picked up, blowing through the dead crops, and for the first time, Sarah felt uneasy. She shrugged it off, attributing it to nerves. She wasn't used to being alone in such an isolated place. The door to the silo was rusted shut. Sarah cursed under her breath, grabbing her crowbar to pry it open. After several attempts, the door finally gave way with a loud creak, revealing a dark interior. The smell hit her immediately, a foul stench, like something had died inside. She hesitated but pressed forward, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The inside of the silo was cold, much colder than it should have been on a summer evening. The walls were covered in a strange, dark substance that she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't mold, but it looked like something had seeped into the walls over time. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped inside, her boots crunching on the dirt-covered floor. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the silo, causing Sarah to jump. She spun around, her flashlight flickering as she scanned the space. There was nothing. No one. The wind must have slammed the door shut, she told herself, though the uneasy feeling gnawed at her. She continued to explore, her footsteps echoing in the hollow space. There was something strange about the silo. It felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the darkness felt too thick, too suffocating. As she reached the far end of the silo, her flashlight flickered again, the beam barely cutting through the blackness. That's when she heard it. A faint sound, like whispering, coming from the walls. It was low, barely audible at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she froze, listening. The whispers seemed to be saying her name, but that was impossible. She was alone. The cold in the silo grew more intense, and the whispering became a cacophony of voices. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she backed away, her flashlight flickering wildly. The dark substance on the walls seemed to pulse, moving as though alive. Without thinking, Sarah bolted for the door, her heart racing as the whispers turned into screams. She slammed into the door, forcing it open and stumbling out into the night. The cold air of the silo was replaced by the dry, warm night, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left her. She sprinted back to her truck, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the keys. As the engine roared to life, Sarah glanced back at the silo, now bathed in moonlight. She could still hear the faint sound of whispers, carried on the wind as she sped away from the farm. The next morning, Sarah's uncle found her at home, pale and shaking. She refused to talk about what had happened, but she begged him to sell the farm, to leave the land to rot. When he went to the farm later that week, the silo door was shut tight, and there was no sign of Sarah's footprints inside. The farm was never sold. No one ever went near the silo again. Jake had inherited the old farm after his grandfather passed away. It was a sprawling, isolated property, far from the town. The nearest neighbor was a good 2 miles away, and the land was surrounded by dense woods. The old farmhouse stood in the middle of the fields, its paint peeling and the windows covered in dust. The barns were worn down, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden walls. Despite its neglected state, Jake had decided to stay for a while, to fix it up and perhaps sell it later. His first night there was quiet, almost too quiet. The wind outside seemed to die down the moment the sun set, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against the walls of the farmhouse. Jake sat in the living room, sipping coffee, the only sound being the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. The silence was thick, unnerving even. Around midnight, as Jake lay in bed, something woke him. A faint sound, distant but clear, coming from outside. He listened carefully, straining to hear through the thick walls. It was a soft tapping sound, rhythmic, like footsteps. It stopped suddenly, and Jake shook it off, convincing himself it was probably the wind. The next morning, he explored the farm, taking a look at the barns and the old equipment. One of the barns, larger than the others, was locked shut. Jake found the key in the house and opened it, revealing old farming tools and equipment covered in dust. But something felt off. The air inside the barn was stale, almost too still. He decided not to linger. The second night was worse. The same sound woke him again, soft footsteps, but this time, closer. Jake sat up in bed, his heart racing. The sound was coming from the front porch. He crept out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the window. There was no one there, just the moonlight casting long shadows across the empty field. By the third night, Jake was on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the farm, that something was watching him. He kept his flashlight by the bed and a heavy wrench on the floor, just in case. The footsteps came again, louder this time, moving from the front porch to the side of the house. Jake grabbed the flashlight and ran to the window, shining the beam outside. There was nothing, just the empty yard and the dark barns in the distance. As the days passed, Jake found himself growing more paranoid. The once quiet, peaceful fields now felt ominous. During the day, he would catch glimpses of movement in the woods at the edge of the property, but when he looked closer, there was nothing there. The barn that he had unlocked felt like it was hiding something, its stillness oppressive. The last night on the farm, Jake had enough. The footsteps were louder, now circling the house. He bolted out of bed, wrench in hand, and threw open the door, ready to confront whatever or whoever was out there. The cold night air hit him as he stood on the porch, the moon casting eerie shadows across the yard. But there was nothing, only silence. Then, from the barn, he heard it. A low, deep creaking, like something heavy moving inside. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew he had locked the barn after his last visit, and yet, the door was slightly ajar. Slowly, he approached the barn, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees as he reached for the door. Inside, the barn was dark, the faint moonlight barely illuminating the old equipment. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Jake stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a loud bang, the sound echoing through the empty space. Jake spun around, his flashlight flickering as he tried to see what had closed the door. From the back of the barn, a shadow moved. Jake froze, the beam of his flashlight catching the faint outline of something, or someone, standing in the darkness. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It was tall, its face obscured by the shadows, but the presence was undeniable. Jake backed away, his mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. The door was shut, and the figure was closing in, its footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. The wrench in his hand felt useless, the weight of fear paralyzing him. As the figure drew closer, the air grew colder, and the silence in the barn became deafening. Jake's flashlight flickered again, then went out, plunging the barn into complete darkness. The last thing he heard before everything went silent was the sound of slow, deliberate breathing, just inches away from his face. The next morning, the farm was quiet once again, the sun rising over the fields as if nothing had happened. The neighbors found the farmhouse empty, Jake's truck still parked outside. The barn door was locked, just as Jake had left it. No one ever saw Jake again.